Welcome back. I'm Ed Zaworski, your local plant pathologist, extension plant pathologist, former diagnostician. Today I'm joined by Dr. Aaron Gassmann from the Department of Plant Pathology and Entomology here at Iowa State, and we're going to be talking Western corn rootworm and resistance to BT. Sound
Yeah,
about right?
that that's absolutely right. And I'll just say, for my colleagues back in the department, it's plant pathology, entomology, and microbiology, but we won't quibble on the details here.
Yeah. It's there's something there, but we got to make sure we get it right. Yeah, plant pathology, entomology, and microbiology. So, just to introduce Aaron, he got his bachelor's in biology at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. Then he went on to get his PhD in ecology and evolution at Iowa State, State University of New York. I see state, and I automatically think Iowa State at Stony Brook. He's currently a professor in the PPEM department here at ISU, and he has a research and teaching appointment. And he focuses on interactions between insect pests and corn. Right?
That's a great summary. And
okay.
Thanks for. I'll have to remember that for the future, just to encapsulate everything so succinctly. Yeah.
So, obviously, we're going to be talking Western corn rootworm and BT. So, I'm sure that if somebody's watching this video, they probably have an idea of what Western corn rootworm is. But just in case, maybe they're new, what is Western corn rootworm and what damage does it cause?
Sure. Well, Western corn rootworm is one of two rootworm species that's a pest of corn here in Iowa. And corn rootworm really is among the most serious pests of corn in the Midwest. This is an insect that has a life cycle that's tightly linked its only agricultural host, which is corn. The insect has only one generation per year, and most of that life cycle is spent in the soil. So we can pick up the life cycle, say, in the summertime when adults are in the field, and people, if they've scouted fields or have been in cornfields very often, they've come across this insect. It's a yellow and black beetle, maybe about a little over a centimeter in length. And the other species that we have is the northern corn rootworm, and that's a solid-colored insect in the adult stage, and that can range anywhere from yellow to brown. But western corn rootworm, when those adults are in the field, they're feeding on silk and pollen, and then they're going and they're depositing eggs into the soil of the cornfield. And those eggs will sit in the soil dormant through the fall and the winter. They'll undergo what's called a diapause, or this extended period of inactivity. And then in the spring, based on degree days, those eggs will hatch, and the larvae will move through the soil and seek out corn roots. And corn is the only agricultural crop on which they can survive. So if the field is planted to something else, like soybean, for example, those larvae will simply perish. It's not possible for them to feed on other roots other than corn and live. So then those larvae find their way to the corn plants, and they begin feeding on the roots. And a lot of that feeding actually involves tunneling through the roots. So they're more akin to something like a European corn borer in a way, in the sense that they're moving within the plant and feeding, versus something like a Japanese beetle adult that might be, grazing on a leaf, for example. So they're tunneling within those corn roots and feeding, and then they'll exit the roots periodically and re-enter, and they'll go through 3 stages or instars. And then they'll metamorphose and pupate in the soil, and then adults will emerge. Adult emergence usually begins in Iowa around the 1st of July. It fluctuates from year to year, depends a lot on degree day accumulation, but 1st of July is typically when we see those first adults. The first larvae eclose from eggs typically around the 1st of June. And then once those adults start emerging, they'll remain in the cornfield feeding on corn silk and pollen well into August, and you can even find adults, if there are weedy species in the field like water hemp, you'd find adults feeding on that pollen even into September. But most of their life cycle, the adult life cycle or stage, I should say, would be completed around the middle of August, and they'll have finished laying eggs at that time.
Yeah, I've definitely seen them hanging out in my garden, the adults.
You most likely you could see either species, but you most likely saw the northern corn
Oh,
rootworm,
okay.
which is a little bit more mobile. So western corn rootworm tends to remain in cornfields unless it's really late in the season and there's simply um, very limited food resources in that cornfield. So when the corn ear is hardened and there isn't any silk or pollen available, they may move and seek out weedy hosts like water hemp. The northern corn rootworm is much more mobile as an adult within the landscape. So it'll often leave the cornfield and it'll visit people's gardens. They love to feed on squash blossoms, for example, but other plants as well. And they'll also be seen in soybean plants feeding on foliage as adults. But then they move back into the cornfield and lay eggs. So they're a little bit more active moving around the landscape than the western corn rootworm tends to be.
Gotcha. What's the primary damage that they do to the corn crop?
Yeah, most of the yield loss associated with corn rootworm comes from the larval feeding on the roots. So people who are familiar with the anatomy of corn plants and maybe to some extent corn rootworm will know that they feed on those nodal roots as they're developing, and they'll feed on the actively growing node as that corn plant produces nodes sequentially over the course of the season. They'll feed on the actively growing node and prune it, or basically stop those roots from growing. And sometimes they'll actually prune it all the way back to the base of the plant, so that tissue, because of those larvae tunneling through there, not only will it stop growing, but it'll basically die and decompose, and there'll sometimes be complete nodes that are simply absent plant altogether. And with corn rootworm, for each of those nodes that is lost to larval feeding, some nice work done at University of Illinois and University of Wisconsin has shown that that'll reduce the yield by 15 to 17% per node. So moisture availability is a big factor influencing the extent to which it reduces yield, but with a large rootworm larval population in a field, those yield losses can be substantial.
Gotcha. That's a good background on Western corn rootworm, right? I mean,
Yeah, it for people in Iowa, I think it's if they're dealing with continuous corn cultivation, it's certainly a pest that's on their mind, because that continuous those fields in continuous corn production really provide the ideal habitat for Western corn rootworm, and that's where the populations tend to reach their largest size and where the injury from this pest can be most pronounced.
makes sense to me. Like you said, they don't seem to get out of the field as much. And if you have that continuous food source where they can continuously complete their life cycle.
Yeah, yeah. So there will be some movement in the landscape. So say there's a field that comes out of rotation, it was planted to soybeans, it goes back to corn. There will be some movement of corn rootworm into that field. And there are also some individuals, in particular newly mated females, that can engage in long distance dispersal. So they'll basically move up into these upper air currents, and they can travel for hundreds of miles. In fact, sometimes after there are thunderstorms along Lake Michigan, people will find mats of corn rootworm adults that wash up. And these are basically individuals that are engaged in long distance dispersal. But the majority of insects will remain in a single field for their whole life cycle. So those eggs will hatch, the larvae will feed, adults will emerge and mate, and then lay eggs back into the soil of the same field. And that can have really important implications for resistance development that we'll talk about a bit later. But there is some level of movement into other fields, and so that's how they colonize fields once they are moved into corn cultivation. And it doesn't take long for the population to build up, because a single female can produce up to 400 eggs. So once those individuals arrive and start laying eggs, if that field remains in corn cultivation for a few years, populations can become large.
That's amazing considering how small the adults are.
Yeah, that's very true. It's kind of a profound thought that that these tiny individuals can produce that number of eggs, but they often produce them in stages over the course of their life, so they won't enter the soil and lay 400 eggs at once. they'll feed, enter the soil, lay a number of eggs, a few clutches, exit the soil, feed for some more time, and then return and lay eggs again. And that'll go on, for basically the entire life of the adult.
Gotcha. Well, you alluded to the idea of them developing some resistance, so I feel like this is a good opportunity to talk about BT,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. In terms of corn production in Iowa, technology that's widely used for management of rootworm, but also for management of above ground pests, in particular European corn borer, which used to be as serious a pest as corn rootworm in Iowa, but it has been managed very successfully with BT hybrids since the 1990s. So it's an insect that farmers really haven't had to worry about for decades.
So again, I'm sure anybody watching this video or listening has probably heard BT. They've heard the word or the acronym BT. But for those who may know BT, but they don't know exactly what it is, what is BT?
Yeah, a good question. Some people may think it stands for biotechnology, for example, but it, in fact, stands for the scientific name of a bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis. And this is a bacteria that lives in the environment, and it's a naturally occurring pathogen of insects. So when it's if you want to call it natural life cycle, or it will be out in the environment and insects will ingest this bacteria, and then it basically exists in the environment as a spore. And that spore is bound to a protein crystal, which is kind of an unusual thing to think about. Maybe we think about, salts, for example, as forming crystals, but this is a protein crystal. And those protein crystals, once they enter the stomach of the insect, are released, dissolved, and then cleaved, and they go from being what's called a protoxin, which is inactive, to being an active toxin, which then binds to the insect midgut. And through a series of steps, some of which are well understood, some of which aren't to this day really known, but it causes the insect midgut cells to lyse, to rupture. This is driven primarily by the formation of pores, like these protein subunits. Once they're in the active form, they bind together and basically make what's like a little donut.
Okay.
Ring of proteins that then inserts into the cell membrane.
Okay.
And that disrupts the osmotic potential and causes those cells to expand and eventually rupture.
Gotcha.
So the bacteriums out there in the environment has these toxins as a crystal structure, and that's why we refer to cryotoxins. People might hear about things like Cry1AB or Cry3BB1. Those are different types of crystalline toxins that will be bound to these bacteria. So anyway, what's been done through genetic engineering is that the genes that encode for specific crystals, or I should say specific toxins in that larger crystal matrix, have been inserted into crop plants, in particular in the U.S. anyway, corn and cotton. But once you get outside of the U.S., actually BT soybean is also a really important crop. And so in its native form, BT produces a whole cocktail of toxins. But in terms of genetically engineered crops, individual BT toxins are selected and placed into the crop plant. So then it's producing the same insecticidal agent that this insect pathogenic bacterium would be producing. Now the crop plants are producing it, and it causes the same effect. It causes the insect midgut to lyse. It causes the insect to die when it feeds on a BT crop.
And there's lots of these BT toxins that correspond to different pests, and in some cases there's multiple toxins for one pest, right?
Yes, all of that is correct, and it's an important thing for people to keep in mind when they're selecting different BT varieties, to make sure that it contains toxins that are active against the pests that they're trying to manage. So, for example, corn that produces a toxin against European corn borer, that toxin won't have any effect on corn rootworm, and vice versa. So, there's a fairly high level of specificity there.
Mm-hmm. So we've got these BT toxins that we're inserting into plants to help control insects that are predating on them, more or less, right? So now we're experiencing issues with resistance to these BT toxins, right?
It's been something that's been present in Iowa for quite a while now, well over a decade. Issues around corn rootworm and BT resistance, in particular, Western corn rootworm. And yeah, so the first, BT traits, or the first BT trait for management of corn rootworm, was available to farmers beginning in 2003. It was a Monsanto yield guard trait, the Cry3BB1 toxin. And by 2009, there were populations in Iowa that had developed resistance to it. Now, there are other toxins out there, and so those have been useful to bridge that technology, and allow farmers to keep managing corn rootworm with BT corn. But as time has gone by, we've seen additional cases of resistance, or populations with resistance to additional toxins. And so now we're to a point where there appears to be fairly widespread resistance at varying levels, basically.
Gotcha. So in the case of Western corn rootworm, how many BT toxins are there available for someone to?
So there's a total of 4.
4.
So there's the Cry3BB1 trait that I mentioned, that's yield guard rootworm. Then there's Syngenta Agrasure, which is mCry3A. And that was subsequently combined with a second toxin, eCry3.1AB, in the Duracade hybrids that they have. What we found is that exposure of the rootworm to the yield guard rootworm trait generated Cry3BB1 resistance, and that had cross resistance to those other traits. So basically, from the rootworm's perspective, there's quite a bit of similarity among 3 of the 4 rootworm active BT toxins. So there's widespread resistance to the Cry3BB1 trait, and then that also carries over to the 2 traits that are in Agrasure corn. More pronounced with Agrasure rootworm than with the Duracade trait, but it still reduces the performance in terms of killing the larvae. And then there's a in a way a very different BT trait that's a binary toxin. So it's called GPP34, TPP35. It used to be called Cry3435. This is a Herculex rootworm trait, and it has seems to have a different mode of action. So it's binding to different receptors in the midgut. Still likely this mechanism of pore formation that's leading to death of the rootworm, but not the same receptors involved. So we don't see cross resistance between the Cry3 toxins and this 34-35 toxin. But we have seen cases of resistance to that trait developing here as well in Iowa, and also quite a bit of work in Nebraska documenting resistance to 34-35. So now we're at a point, where these technologies have been around for getting close to, for over a decade in all cases. In some cases, 2 decades.
Right.
Where we have populations that have developed resistance to all of them.
So is it a widespread issue that we have resistance to all 4 of them, or?
I think it's widespread in the sense that it can be found throughout much of Iowa. Sure. I think, the bigger challenge is that, what is kind of the level of variation from one population to the next in terms of how resistant they are. But, the probability of finding a population in northeastern Iowa versus northwestern Iowa versus central Iowa, I think is fairly similar. So it's resistance has been seen in all of these areas.
And so in the case of that first gene, I'm not going to be any good at reciting the.
It's a lot to keep track. No, I agree, and so I think that's
you do very well.
A challenge, for anyone working with BT traits to manage pests, is just trying to keep everything straight in terms of the different traits that are available. But
you said so from 2003 to 2009, it was the Cry3BB1.
Yeah, that was the first toxin to come out, and other ones came out before 2009. Like both the Agrasure rootworm and Herculex rootworm traits. But it was by 2009 we were seeing the first cases of pest resistance.
So only 6 years in, I
Yeah.
mean, I guess I say only. I don't know that that's a long or a short amount of time for something to gain resistance, but
I think for BT traits, it was a very short amount of time, and it was surprising to people because other traits had been around, for longer than that, and there hadn't been any resistance issues.
sure.
And we could get into kind of the aspects of those traits and the pest crop interaction if you like, and why that might have happened. But I think the big thing was that based on things like European corn borer and BT corn, the expectation was that the rootworm trait would last for quite a while. And I think people were very surprised to
Hmm.
see that in 6 years, there were these cases of resistance in the field and high levels of feeding injury, too. So the way we were detecting resistance was to visit fields that had high levels of feeding injury to BT corn and large rootworm populations. And one of the big drivers there gets back to this aspect of Western corn rootworm and how many individuals remain in the same field. And multiple generations basically cycle within a field. Um, and so if a farmer has a field in long-term corn-on-corn production and is using the same BT traits to manage rootworm for multiple seasons, that same population gets selected over and over again for resistance. And laboratory experiments have shown that three years or 3 generations is enough time for a noticeable change in resistance to rise. So that's really what we've seen with corn rootworm and all of the different BT traits is that is a really important driver of resistance. Corn on corn fields where the same BT trait is used for multiple seasons.
So, does anything else in the biology of Western corn rootworm lead to that rapid gain of resistance? I mean, because you mentioned like the European corn borer as well, and that one having a much longer.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a really interesting contrast
Yeah.
because corn borer in Iowa, is still managed very effectively with BT corn. Recently, there have been some cases of resistance in Canada,
Hmm.
which has caused issues for farmers there in some cases. But in Iowa, it's really been smooth sailing so
Sure.
far.
Sure.
Um, and so one thing about corn borer is that it disperses more readily in the landscape. So there aren't populations cycling within a field like there would be with rootworm. Another important factor, I think, is this idea of the dose of the toxin produced by the
Ah.
plant.
Okay.
So BT toxins that target corn borer would be classified as a high dose. And what that means is there's about 25 times more toxin in that plant than is needed to kill a susceptible individual. And when that happens, we see that resistance is typically a recessive trait. So individuals have to have 2 copies of a gene for resistance in order to survive on BT crop. With corn rootworm, it's not really close to a high dose. So, and what that means is that if an individual has just one copy of a resistance gene, that's going to confer a substantial increase in their ability to survive on a BT crop.
Okay.
And that greatly accelerates resistance because with all of these BT crops, there's a refuge present. People know about the refuge requirement where they're basically growing non-BT corn in Iowa in conjunction with BT corn crop. And the whole point of the non-BT plants is to produce susceptible individuals.
Hmm.
Those individuals mate with any resisted individuals that arise and produce offspring that are heterozygous, since they only have one copy of a resistance gene. So in the case of corn borer, all of those heterozygous progeny are going to die if they feed on BT corn.
Sure.
In the case of corn rootworm, a fairly large proportion, 30, 40, 50% are going to be able to survive. And that substantially accelerates the rate of resistance evolution. So I think it's, those are 2 of the really important factors, this limited adult dispersal where population cycles within a field, coupled with this lack of a high dose for the BT traits and this non-recessive inheritance of resistance that have, facilitated rapid adaptation by the pest to BT corn.
Gotcha. Aaron, you've kind of alluded to some of the ways that we can limit the resistance gained by these insects when using BT crops. And granted, obviously you mentioned that some of these Western corn rootworm are already resistant to all of the traits for BT, so it might be too late in those cases. But yeah, I mean, what are some ways? You mentioned refuge crops, you mentioned high dose of BT as ways to limit the chances of gaining resistance, but what are some of the other ways that we can do resistance management?
Yeah, so in this area of insect resistance management in the U.S., refuges are really like a keystone feature. And the whole idea there is to have a non-BT crop or host plant that's going to support the survival of BT susceptible insects. And these insects then can mate with any resistant insects that evolve in the field and generate progeny that only have one copy of a resistance gene. So that the fitness then or survival of those individuals that are heterozygous for resistance or just have one copy of the resistance allele is really important, because the refuges will be there to try and keep those present in the population. And if a BT crop achieves what we would refer to as a high dose, like BT corn for management of corn borer, those heterozygous individuals cannot survive. So they'll die on a BT crop. In the case of corn rootworm, where a high dose isn't present, those heterozygotes are able to survive. And so that really reduces the effectiveness of the refuge to delay resistance, but it's still important. And the other thing that is often used is the idea of pyramiding BT toxins. So BT crop will produce multiple toxins that kill the same pest. And the idea is that if insects are resistant to one toxin, they'll be killed by the second, and vice versa. And so for both corn borer and corn rootworm, there are BT pyramids that are available. But one really important thing there is that the capacity of a pyramid to delay resistance depends on the level of susceptibility of that pest to either toxin in the pyramid. And if insects have evolved or begun to evolve resistance to one of those toxins, that's going to substantially reduce the capacity of the pyramid to delay resistance. And in fact, we can end up with a pest population that's resistant to both traits in a pyramid. And that's more or less what we've seen with corn rootworm. So there was resistance to the Cry3 traits, and those were managed with BT corn that produced 34, 35 in Cry3, something like Smart Stacks. So that is continuing to select for Cry3 resistance, but now it's also selecting for resistance to the 34, 35 trait. And eventually led to populations then that have resistance to both of those toxins.
So those are some of the things, but not necessarily in the case of corn rootworm, which is kind of ahead of the game here as far as...
It's been a challenge to manage resistance with that pest. So some of the same strategies that worked very well for something like European corn borer weren't nearly as effective with Western corn rootworm.
So kind of thinking along those lines, what other types of management are used alongside BT?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing that we know with corn rootworm, and we've seen repeatedly, is that it's those fields that are in continuous corn production where the same BT traits are used for multiple seasons that generate resistant populations and also large rootworm populations, where farmers can experience high levels of feeding injury to BT corn. As I mentioned early on, corn rootworm, Western corn rootworm and Northern corn rootworm, they have a life cycle that's really tightly linked to corn. And so we can use that to our advantage. Simply by rotating a field out of corn production, that's going to kill all of those larvae that hatch the following season when the field isn't planted to corn. There's, in Iowa, there's very limited instances of what's called rotation resistance. We have some rotation resistance with Northern corn rootworm, where some of those eggs may not hatch in the field. And when the field goes back to corn, they'll hatch. But in the case of Western corn rootworm, we really haven't seen rotation resistance in Iowa. So rotating that field out of corn production is more or less going to reset the rootworm population, wipe the slate clean, if you will. And so then when the farmer goes back to corn, rootworm won't be an issue in that first year, and this will delay the buildup of the populations. Over time, resistance can still develop in the landscape, especially as insects are recolonizing that field if it has Bt traits that are the same as Bt traits in neighboring fields. But the dynamic is going to be a lot more drawn out. It's going to take a lot longer for that pest population to develop resistance, and it's going to take much longer for it to reach a stage that's going to cause issues, or at least the likelihood of it reaching that density is greatly reduced because periodically the field is being moved out of corn production. So crop rotation, it's a very simple way that makes the field much less hospitable to corn rootworm, can keep those large populations from arising, and can also help to delay the development of resistance.
Are there any other things? Are people using pesticides in concert with Bt traits and crop rotation at all for this, or?
So, for the most part, what we've seen both in our own research and research in other places, that combining in soil-applied insecticides with Bt corn often isn't going to be a profitable strategy. If the Bt traits are working, insecticides aren't needed. If they're not working as well, then the question is, because of resistance, should someone be paying for those traits, or would it be better just to use non-rootworm traded corn with soil-applied insecticide? There could be instances, especially if someone has a large rootworm population, they've seen injury to Bt corn, where they may choose to combine those tactics in a field. But, really in terms of managing the population and keeping the rootworm at lower abundance, crop rotation is going to be very beneficial. And then they can also think about managing the adults, although that through an insecticidal spray, but that has to be well timed. And so the whole idea there is to wait until the majority of the female rootworm have emerged, but before they begin laying eggs. So corn rootworm is what we refer to, Western corn rootworm, as protandrous species. So that means that the males emerge slightly before the females as adults. So if you were to plot out the emergence curve of adult male corn rootworm versus female Western corn rootworm, it'd be about 5 days. That peak would be about 5 days earlier. So typically, someone would want to wait until they start to see those first few gravid females in the field. And that would be the time to make an insecticide application, because that means that the majority of those females have emerged, but very few of them have started to lay eggs yet. And so an application at that time can often, greatly reduce the overall population size and reduce the number of eggs that are going into the soil for next year. But if it's not well timed, if it's, say, just done more or less out of convenience, if someone's making a fungicide application, the benefit in terms of reducing egg laying is going to be reduced. So that's another way to reduce the overall population. And even if resistance is present, then there's going to just be less overall feeding injury. And oftentimes, too, with resistance, right, it's not an all or nothing kind of phenomenon. There can be different levels of resistance in terms of some populations that simply won't be killed by the Bt traits. In other cases, maybe half as many individuals as would normally be killed are going to die. And so in that case, then just reducing the overall population size can help to get that rootworm feeding injury to a more acceptable level. So it can be a challenging problem. Yeah, challenging endeavor, a challenging problem to deal with if someone has, a population with an unknown level of resistance. What level of root protection could they expect from the Bt trait? Would there be a benefit from combining it with an insecticide, or would they be better off just choosing one tactic or the other? And then, to what extent might they be able to reduce the abundance either through an insecticidal spray of the adults, or, again, ideally just by rotating that field out of corn production?
You mentioned the timing being very important with the potential use of an insecticide for the adults. Are there any tools for people to use to help predict that timing, or is it kind of just a scouting thing?
Scouting really becomes a key component, and just understanding what's going on in the field. If someone has a field where they have reason to suspect that rootworm populations were beginning to build the season before. Maybe they were observing lodging during harvest, or maybe they actually went out and dug roots the previous year and started to see higher levels of feeding injury. Those are the types of fields that they'll want to get out into, and even just fields that are at high risk because they've been in corn production for longer. And, once the end of June rolls around, beginning of July, begin visiting those fields and making some observations about the abundance of corn rootworm, how many adults per plant, for example. And that will also then provide information on, are the gravid females starting to appear in the field, and then would an adult spray be warranted?
With regards to resistance and identifying it, and in, the idea of scouting, right? Are there ways that a farmer can test their Western corn rootworm population to see if it has resistance, or is it more or less you're going out there and seeing if a BT trait is being used and there's still lots of Western corn rootworm pressure, you may have resistance?
That would be a very good indicator, be a reason to strongly suspect resistance. Similarly, observing high levels of feeding injury to BT corn. It's only through, laboratory bioassays at this point that we can quantify the level of resistance. But if a farmer sees that feeding injury and sees those large populations, that's reason to strongly suspect resistance. I would say, feeding injury is going to be more informative than adult numbers, although seeing high numbers of adults is also very useful. There is the possibility that those insects have moved in from another field. But unless it's a field that's silking really late in the season, typically if they're seeing a lot of adults, they're going to also see root injury. But digging roots in that field and observing the amount of rootworm feeding injury is sort of the best way to understand how those BT traits are working. And if they're starting to observe high levels of injury, half a node, for example, or 3/4 of a node or a full node, that's a great field to rotate out of corn production the next year. The person should understand that if they were to go back and use the same approach, same, say, BT traits the next season, they're probably going to have even higher levels of injury. In some cases, the weather may help us. We may have a really cold winter, or it may be very wet right after planting, and that's going to reduce either the ability of the eggs to survive or the establishment of those larvae. But in general, I often see kind of an incremental or sometimes fairly rapid building of those rootworm populations over time. And so as that level of injury starts to increase, that's really a time when someone wants to think about how to manage the abundance of rootworm, either through rotation or perhaps, spraying the adults.
So that, I feel, is a good segue into the next question I want to ask you. I want to ask you, what are the best practices of somebody managing Western corn rootworm? And I kind of wanted to ask it in two parts. What are the best practices of somebody who knows they have resistant populations or thinks they have resistant populations? And what are the best practices for somebody who probably doesn't have a resistant population of Western corn rootworm?
Yeah, I think that the overarching theme or the thing to keep in mind is the idea of diversifying management. Going back to that idea again that fields in continuous corn production where the same traits are used, transgenic traits are used, are the ones that are going to have most issues with resistance. So if someone can incorporate some level of crop rotation, even if it's once every 5 years, that's going to go a long way towards dealing with the rootworm issues in their field. Other things to think about would just be ways. So that's kind of like the easiest. We'll start there. I guess say that's sort of the easiest scenario. Even better yet is someone who can rotate a field every 3 years into soybeans. So those fields are pretty easy to deal with. It's those fields that are in long-term corn-on-corn production that are more challenging. And so there, I think someone needs to be more conscious of what's going on with the rootworm populations and try to evaluate, how well rootworm management is working season to season by digging roots or going out and looking at adult populations. So, if they're starting to see that level of root injury increasing, on BT hybrids may want to think about ways to reduce the just overall abundance of rootworm through spraying adults. They could think about using a soil applied insecticide, but would need to also consider the economics of it. If using those two tactics is going to be worthwhile. The other thing to think about there too is that soil applied insecticides, while they improve standability, they protect roots in the root zone. There's plenty of root tissue still present for the rootworm to feed on, and often we don't see that big of a reduction in adult emergence when insecticides are used at planting. So what this means is if they're using Bt traits in soil applied insecticide, they're continuing to select for Bt resistance and churning out Bt resistant insects into their field. So that's going to really produce a persistent problem for them. So it's not, in terms of a long-term solution, it's not going to be ideal. They may want to consider, if they can get the populations under control, there's new technology available through Bayer that uses RNA interference. So something like SmartStax Pro, where there's a new mode of action for corn rootworm. So this would be able to kill those Bt resistant insects. That one thing to keep in mind is that, that in terms of the vulnerability to resistance evolution is very similar to Bt traits. So if someone takes this new technology and uses it in a corn-on-corn situation for several years, then they run the risk of developing resistance to this new technology for which we currently don't have any resistance issues. So this can be, a really valuable tool for someone to get ahead of these resistant populations if it's not overused. So someone in that situation might want to consider, can they use some crop rotation? Can they use this newer technology? Could they alternate the new technology with non-rootworm traded corn that has insecticide on it, so they're not continuing to select for Bt resistance? So I think, the key is really thinking about diversified management.
Can I ask you a worst case scenario one? Like, let's say somebody knows they have, who knows, maybe they have sent off some rootworms to your lab or something. They've gone through a bioassay. I don't know that that's even possible, but let's say,
that's something
theoretical.
We've done quite a bit over the years. Yeah, okay. So we'll go out and visit fields and bring rootworm into the lab and see how they survive on different Bt varieties, and that's led us, to get a handle on the current situation in the state in terms of Bt resistance.
So if they've got a known resistant population, in this scenario, do you recommend them not planting corn with Bt traits? Is there any advantage? I was wondering as I was reading through one of your papers, is there a fitness cost to having resistance? If you get rid of the Bt trait entirely, do these insects revert back to being susceptible ever? It's kind of a wild question.
So we've looked at that in the lab quite a bit, and we see that insects that are resistant, if we rear them on non-Bt corn and compare them to a susceptible strain, they tend not to do quite as well. Not as many survive to adulthood, or they don't lay as many eggs, for example. And if we just take a population that's resistant and we remove selection for resistance, we rear the insects on non-Bt corn for multiple years, or multiple generations, I should say, we'll see resistance decrease over time. But it's very slow. So there's really no way to go from having a resistant population and letting it revert to being susceptible. With corn rootworm that only has one generation per year, it would take a few decades, for it to become fully susceptible again. And as long as there's some elevated level of resistance, what that means is resistance frequency would ramp up very quickly once someone went back to using Bt corn. So there's no way to sort of reverse that once it's present. But I think more important is thinking about managing those populations, reducing the overall abundance. We have seen in our work that crop rotation does reduce resistance slightly, and that has simply to do with the population in that field being extirpated or killed off, and then the field being recolonized by neighboring fields. And so that sort of mixing of individuals from among those fields can reduce the overall level of resistance, but it really depends on what's in the neighboring fields. And if those are all fields that are in continuous corn and have quite a bit of Bt trait use, then it's going to be Bt resistant insects that are moving into that rotated field. But what it does do is reduce the population. So that can help a technology that's been compromised by resistance to perform better. I think, really having, if farmers can get out or crop consultants can get out and just see how rootworm management is working, that can go a long way towards helping them to make the right decision. And, the thing about resistance is it's a genetically based change in a pest population that reduces susceptibility to a management tactic. So if a population is resistant to a set of Bt traits, if those Bt traits are used the next year, it's going to produce the same outcome. And it may even be worse because the population may be larger or the level of resistance may have increased somewhat. So just being aware of what's going on in the field year to year and then using that information, to someone using it to their advantage to try and improve their decision-making process is really the best approach.
So scout and diversify your management strategies. It sounds like
those are key things to keep in mind. Yeah, that can help with rootworm management and avoid long-term corn on corn where the same transgenic traits are used for multiple seasons.
Perfect. Well, before we get into acknowledgments and resources you want to point people towards, Aaron, is there anything we missed?
Seems like we've covered a lot of ground here today.
With that, Aaron, acknowledgments and resources for people on Western corn rootworm.
Well, I think that our Iowa State University Extension entomologist, Dr. Aaron Hodgson, is really a great resource when it comes to learning more about corn rootworm and corn rootworm management. And she and her team have a lot of resources that are available online if someone wants to find out more about corn rootworm and how to manage this pest. And also, I know she does a number of events around the state, so hopefully people have an opportunity to go out in the winter and listen to one of her talks.
Any publications or anything we can point people towards for reading up on this?
That's a good question. So ICM is always a good resource, and there are a few newsletters out that summarize information on corn rootworm biology and also corn rootworm management. I think can help people in terms of thinking about how to approach rootworm management in their field.
Great. Well, that seems like a good place to wrap it up. Thanks for tuning in, folks.
Thanks, Ed. Really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk with you today.
Same.